Chapter 6. Hello World. The first real people to enter the virtual world of freedom would enter many, many years later than the events that had shaped the world and the histories of freedom. The NPCs had lived rich lives, many respawning to live more than one, though more still perishing from the ravages of time. Prominent figures in history would be the least likely to make reappearances, kings of men or the elders of elves, because these were the people who would be remembered, not the ones who were there to simply make up the numbers. Creatures that fell within the faceless ranks of the armies and the beasts that were killed before their time all had second, third, and more chances to live, to respawn, and that was where they managed to find their comfort. It was not known throughout the sentient races the exact yardstick that was used to determine if a person or a creature was respawned once they were killed, but it was generally believed by most of the sentient races within freedom that if you kept your head down and did as you were told, your reward was practical immortality. If you strove for a better life and took on the mantle of a lord, chief, or king, then this boon could be taken from you as your life would already have been a reward in itself. It was no small wonder, then, that the few who had taken up such mantles generally did so through either the necessity to help their kind or because life was just so difficult otherwise. Francis and Jake had been amongst the first wave of players to enter Freedom Online. That was, of course, after all of the beta testers and the privileged few who were allowed early access, so that they may get a head start on the rest of the playership. These two players had arranged between them that if they were presented with the character selection screen upon entry, they would select human as their race, plain and simple. It was a good plan generally if they chose the same race and had entered a game in the same location. They would be placed within the virtual world close to each other, and having a friend in a game usually meant that things would become much easier. "It's all just so real," Francis said as soon as his virtual hand had materialized before his face. "I mean, just look at this." His voice was filled with wonder, and the sentiment made Jake laugh. "Kinda makes you glad you didn't choose to be an ogre or something." "Imagine having to look at that in the mirror every day for the next year," Jake replied. "Can't go wrong with human." "You can say that again?" Francis trailed off. "Hey, do you think that if it's so realistic that—" he queried slowly and then looked down at himself. He was wearing a simple cloth around his waist, as was Jake. Francis tugged the cloth away from himself so that he could see all the way down to where his manhood had been. In all of the games he had ever played, from the modded version of Tomb Raider to the life simulator, The Sims, whenever anyone had tried to take a peek at the human form, they were never presented with the real thing. This time, though, Francis was shocked at what he saw as nestled down beneath a healthy amount of hair sat an exact carbon copy of his own human meat and 2 veg. They could have made it bigger," he announced loudly. "Yeah, but mine was already so big. Only so many pixels out there, you know," Jake quipped. He had always loved toilet humor, and if that also gave him the chance to big himself up, he was grasping it with both hands. "What do you think we should do?" Francis asked. "Same as in every game, Francis, my old mate. We go get some gear and start doing some quests. I don't see a starter kit or anything in my inventory, so I guess it's head to the nearest town." At the mention of an inventory, Francis realized that he too could look inside his own mentally. The feeling was odd, and the panel filled his vision as he viewed it. Though he noticed he could manipulate everything before him with his mind, upon doing so, he confirmed that he did not carry any kit or equipment either. That was always what starter quests were for, though. They gave a noob some piece of gear to test out against rats or low-level skeletons. Then they would be rewarded with something slightly less rubbish and possibly shiny new level, along with attribute or stat points. What they needed to find was the quest giver, or at least some kind of tutorial or something. Jake stepped up onto a fallen log so that he was slightly higher up than Francis and seemed to sniff the air as he looked all around himself. Right, we got, he pointed as he spoke in each general direction. Mountains that way, the sea over there, and what looks like a huge castle, or something over that way. Well, castles are always a good place to start, right? Francis stated. Yep, and that's where we're going. Come on, don't want to be late for our first day questing, do we? Jake replied. It took longer than both of the men had expected, though they did eventually arrive at a large stone wall in the center of a particularly flat field. It snaked away into the distance, and although they couldn't see it as they closed in on the huge wooden gates before them, the outer wall formed a huge circle around the entirety of the city within. Welcome to the Citadel, travelers. Humans are always welcome within, so please enter and see how the Citadel can fit your needs. The voice that came from the armored guard at the gates sounded far more announcer-esque than either Francis or Jake would have expected, though with his words had come the loud clang of some hidden metal bolt, and the wooden gates slowly parted to allow them entry to the city within. Well, seems like this is the place to be, Jake announced as he walked through the threshold into the city beyond. Francis shrugged his shoulders and followed. This was what they had come for anyway. Weapons and armor? Get your weapons and armor here? A loud voice immediately came from a man standing next to a small, covered wagon full of mismatched arms and armor of all kinds. Bread and water, the finest our bakery has to offer, another merchant called from her stand. The finest jewelry in all of freedom is right here. Prove that you're richer than everyone else, if not better. That one made Francis frown, though he made no moves towards any of the merchants or their wares. He always knew it was best to get an idea of your surroundings before spending all of your coin. Not that they had any anyway. What do you think? Clear out the rats in a tavern cellar for a few gold pieces? Go find a lost child and tell them to go home for dinner, Jake said with a smile as they walked. The ground beneath their feet had been paved with what looked like crushed and compressed stone, and the buildings themselves actually didn't look too different. If anything, the place had the feel of a medieval castle village, though slightly more civilized and much bigger and well spaced out. The people who walked the streets actually all seemed quite normal, though what was missing from a lot of the games Jake and Francis had played before was a little diversity. It was difficult to notice at first because everything was seemingly so standard, and then it finally dawned on Francis what was missing. It's the other races, isn't it? He announced loudly. Jake turned to face him with a very confused look on his face. Apparently he hadn't noticed that there was a problem. Come on, every time we've ever played an MMO, we go to the first town and there's a whole bunch of different races and players just bounding around aimlessly. Look around. There are only humans here. It's weird, isn't it? Jake looked around as though he'd opened his eyes for the first time, and then he understood too. This was indeed the very reason why everything seemed like it was slightly off, yet as individual parts, it was difficult to pinpoint that anything was wrong. Francis walked over to the nearest market stand, which looked as though it was a simple fruit vendor. Good day to you. If you are looking for the finest fruits in all of freedom, then you must look no further. Tell me, what are you in search of today? The vendor announced with a huge smile. He was a shorter man, thin, with a hopeful expression on his face. Nothing for me today, friend, Francis stated. Just a question. I thought we may see some other races here, or perhaps even some travelers like myself. Seems like there are only humans. The vendor's smile disappeared immediately, and he shook his hands quickly. No, I don't want any trouble. Nothing from me at all. His voice trembled as he spoke, and he took a step back from Francis. Francis knew that he could keep asking the vendor, as he seemed unable to leave his stall unattended. Either it was a part of his coding as some sort of basic NPC, or it was otherwise not worth him taking the risk of leaving it unattended. Either way, He felt that it was best not to press the matter with the man, and instead he moved his attention to the next vendor in the line of market stalls. This one, though, anticipating his line of questioning, simply turned and ran, leaving her stall entirely unprotected. "Will you stop scaring off all the locals?" Jake berated Francis as the next merchant began to look sheepish, knowing that he was next in line. "I just want to know what this is all about, and the more they keep shut up about it, the more I want to know," Francis said, throwing his hands up into the air. Just then, an elderly woman came from one of the carts and tapped Francis on the shoulder. The act made him jump, and he turned to see who had interrupted his announcements. "Listen, sounds like you aren't from around here," the woman said in a very frail and croaky voice. "But we don't talk about those sorts of things, what can get us into trouble. It just ain't worth it, you know. So if I were you, I'd keep your trap shut. And when you go to the Black Horse asking for your mug of hot cider..." "Come on, every time we've ever played an MMO, we go to the first town, and there's a whole bunch of different races and players just bounding around aimlessly. Look around. There are only humans here. It's weird, isn't it?" Jake looked around as though he'd opened his eyes for the first time, and then he understood too. This was indeed the very reason why everything seemed like it was slightly off, yet as individual parts, it was difficult to pinpoint that anything was wrong. Francis walked over to the nearest market stand, which looked as though it was a simple fruit vendor. "Good day to you. If you are looking for the finest fruits in all of freedom, then you must look no further. Tell me, what are you in search of today?" the vendor announced with a huge smile. He was a shorter man, thin with a hopeful expression on his face. "Nothing for me today, friend," Francis stated. "Just a question. I thought we may see some other races here, or perhaps even some travelers like myself. Seems like there are only humans." The vendor's smile disappeared immediately, and he shook his hands quickly. "No, I don't want any trouble. Nothing from me at all." His voice trembled as he spoke, and he took a step back from Francis. Francis knew that he could keep asking the vendor, as he seemed unable to leave his stall unattended. Either it was a part of his coding as some sort of basic NPC, or it was otherwise not worth him taking the risk of leaving it unattended. Either way, he felt that it was best not to press the matter with the man, and instead he moved his attention to the next vendor in the line of market stalls. This one, though, anticipating his line of questioning, simply turned and ran, leaving her stall entirely unprotected. "Will you stop scaring off all the locals?" Jake berated Francis as the next merchant began to look sheepish, knowing that he was next in line. "I just want to know what this is all about, and the more they keep shut up about it, the more I want to know," Francis said, throwing his hands up into the air. Just then, an elderly woman came from one of the carts and tapped Francis on the shoulder. The act made him jump, and he turned to see who had interrupted his announcements. "Listen, sounds like you aren't from around here," the woman said in a very frail and croaky voice. "But we don't talk about those sorts of things, what can get us into trouble. It just ain't worth it, you know. So if I were you, I'd keep your trap shut. And when you go to the Black Horse asking for your mug of hot cider..." Her emphasis on the drink was impossible to ignore. "Don't think that anyone there will be telling about all these other things either." Then she tapped Francis on the shoulder, turned, and hobbled away. "The was all that about?" Jake asked in a low tone so that they couldn't be overheard. "That, my friend, sounds like it was the beginning of our very first quest here in freedom. Did you hear what she said? Don't ask about it in the Black Horse, guessing that's a tavern or something. And I'd say we should be asking for a glass of our hot cider." "Oh, why does it have to be hot?" Jake asked. "Because that's the code." "Well, I guess it is. Nobody else in their right mind would ask for their cider hot, would they?" Then, as if by some magical cue, a notification box filled both Jake and Francis's vision. "You have been offered a quest. There's something not quite right about how the people of the city feel about outsiders or the other races. Part 1. Go to the Black Horse. Part 2. Ask for a hot cider. This is a multi-part quest. Rewards varies. Experience, gold. Reputation boosts with unknown. Did you just see that? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer by the way that Francis was smiling. No rat hunting for level 1 here in Freedom today, then, Francis announced with a happy smile. It was nice to think that Freedom was about to offer them something outside of the norm, and Francis had the distinct feeling that Freedom was going to be anything but boring and predictable. It took a while and a couple of questions of the locals, but finding the Black Horse was not too difficult a task. It was a tiny terraced tavern on the far side of the city, nestled upon the inside of the outer wall of the city. What Francis did notice as the pair moved, however, was that it seemed as though this place was arranged in circles around a central point, with each outer ring housing lower and lower classes of people as they went. It stood to reason, then, that they learned that the officials, the Council of the Citadel, as they proclaimed themselves, resided in the very center, in a tall and rather opulent-looking series of towers. "1 hot cider, please, barkeep," Jake announced loudly immediately after entering the tavern. He hadn't even taken the time to assess his surroundings, and if he had, he would have noticed a few very unhappy-looking faces littered about the place, nursing their nondescript drinks. And when he made his announcement, a few of these faces looked up to glare at the pair. "You sure that's what you want?" the bartender asked, cocking a single bushy eyebrow at Jake, as though he was asking for something very dangerous. "Yep, that's what we came for, and that's what we want." "1 hot cider, please," Jake reiterated loudly with a smile. Francis practically face-palmed, but before either of the men knew what was happening, the bartender had given a single nod to whoever it was who had managed to creep up on the pair, and they were immediately plunged into darkness. It took Francis a moment to realize that he had had a burlap sack placed over his head, and he was quickly being prodded to make him move in some unknown direction. They went downstairs through winding corridors, and as they moved, Francis realized that it was getting much colder and smelled very much of damp, and he thought that perhaps their first quest was going to be tavern basement. Rat-related, after all. Eventually, the group came to a halt, and a harsh voice told them to sit. When neither Francis nor Jake made to make any moves, they were both pushed into wooden chairs that had been placed conveniently behind them. "Who sent you?" a deep voice growled. "Someone just told us to come here and what to ask for. We have a quest." Francis answered, not totally sure of himself. "Oh, just sent here, were you? Well, ain't that convenient," a woman's voice replied this time. "Sounds like a spy to me. Sent to find out who or where we are. Let's kill them now and be done with it." "Nah, a spy would never know the code. Besides, if they were sending spies in, it'd be more than these two. Level 1, been a while since I saw anyone that weak," the male voice said. I'll have you know us two were the pair that defeated the Tormented Woods in IO Online last year. Plus, we were a big part of the force that overthrew the kingdom of Eldermere. We aren't just some level 1 nothings." Jake sounded as though he was gobsmacked by the lack of recognition from these people, though nothing came in reply for a long time. "You have any idea what he's talking about?" the woman asked, presumably to the man. "Not a clue. I've never heard of any of these places." The man trailed off in wonder. Then the sacks were pulled from Jake and Francis's heads rather unceremoniously, and peering into Francis's eyes was a rather bemused-looking female orc. "I never heard of no kingdom of Eldermere, or no IO Online. We supposed to be impressed by any of that?" Jake stuttered. He had never imagined that being so close to an orc could have been so realistic. Her skin was a darkish green-brown, and her eyes a piercing yellow like those of a cat. Her hair was black and braided down out of view, and her bottom teeth looked sharp, pointed and protruded over her top lip. She also smelt of damp, as though she had been living underground for a very long time. "Yeah, actually," Jake called out before Francis could gather himself. "Those feats took weeks of planning. So yeah, they're impressive. Now, are you going to tell us what we need to do to complete this quest, or what?" Quest update. There's something not quite right about how the people of this city feel about outsiders or the other races. Part 3. Help the Resistance. This is a multi-part quest. Rewards varies experience, gold. Reputation boosts with unknown. "Oh, that makes sense," Jake announced without taking a breath. "You're the Resistance, right? And we're supposed to help you overthrow your oppressors. Been there, done that." He crossed his arms knowingly. The orc's eyes grew wide at that statement, though the man who had previously been posing as the bartender put a hand on her shoulder. "Listen, lad, these oppressors you speak of aren't something that can be overthrown, and if I were you, I wouldn't go about trying. We call ourselves the Resistance because we resist the rule of the Citadel, not because we want to go and fight them in the streets." "So, what do you do then, and how are we supposed to help?" Francis asked in a much calmer tone than Jake seemed able to. "I'm sure you've noticed already that the Citadel only permits humans inside of these walls," the man asked. Though he winced slightly as the orc lowered her head, Francis nodded. "Well, that says nothing of what they do to the other races that they happen to come across. Every other race in all of freedom is jailed and set to slavery, forced to live underground so that the humans don't have to look at them as they're forced to do their dirty work. Any mention of the other races is enough to get you lashings at best, and military service at worst. What we do down here in the Resistance is help those who need it to escape." "So it's like an underground railroad?" Francis asked. Ain't no rails down here, lad. Just people what want to do better for their fellow beings," the bartender replied. "Speaking of, my name's Talon, and this is Freya." He gestured to the orc. "Behind you, there are Sam and Lawrence." Francis turned his head to see 2 more humans waving sheepishly at him, and it made him smile. "Hi," they all said at once. "Now what you can do for us," Talon said with a smile, "is dig." Talon pointed behind himself to a rather dark and ominous-looking tunnel that led away from their small cave, then produced 2 shovels as though from nowhere and handed them to the players. "You see, I need to be up top running the bar so no one gets suspicious. I need the boys with me, just in case anything happens up there, and Freya has, well, some issues with the dark. We've been digging this tunnel on and off so that we can get people out of the city walls without them being caught by the guards, so you might imagine that it's a pretty important task. Quest update. There's something not quite right about how the people of this city feel about outsiders or the other races. Part 3. Dig. This is a multi-part quest. Rewards varies. Experience, gold, reputation boosts with unknown. "Well, I'm used to doing a bit of digging at the start of a game, so why not?" Jake announced, as he stood up from his chair, taking the shovel as he did so. It was clear to Francis, as it always was, that when presented with an information window with an instruction in it, Jake simply couldn't help himself. "This ain't no game, lad. This is life and death for these people," the bartender said quietly, and Francis wondered if it was so that Freya couldn't hear his words. Francis followed Jake in, taking a shovel, and the pair moved into the tunnel. The dirt was soft and easily shoveled, and Francis was pleased to note that the walls and ceiling did not collapse as the pair dug, which was a very handy mechanic for tunnel digging. "You know what?" Jake managed to say as he breathed heavily. "Why don't they just bring a torch down here so that Freya can help us out? I never thought I'd be saying this in an MMO, but my back's killing me." "I know what you mean. This is much harder than the old point and click, right? Like we actually have to do the work for ourselves. But that Freya, I don't know. Seems to me like she probably went through a few things, and it's just too much for her, you know?" Well, at least we're doing what the quest told us, Jake said. I don't know how much of this I could do if it was just us mining for iron or something. Francis couldn't agree more. It was an odd starter quest as it was, but at least they knew it was what freedom wanted them to do. It felt as though days had passed, though in reality it was merely hours as the pair dug and dug until eventually the bartender returned holding a torch, accompanied by Freya. "This is looking real good, lads. I reckon we're far enough away from the city walls that we can go upwards now," Talon said. "You keep going. Up to the surface now, and we'll be back in a while," he ordered. "Yes, boss? Only too happy, boss," Jake replied sarcastically, and threw out a salute for good measure. Talon didn't reply, though looked a little bemused, turned and walked away with Freya in tow. Both Jake and Francis's hands were worn and calloused, and pain radiated through both their arms and backs. Yet they powered through, and shortly after, they breached the surface of the dirt and were greeted by bright sunshine in a small wooded area. Climbing out of the hole they'd made, Francis turned to look behind himself to see the outside of the city walls a good distance away, definitely far enough so that anyone entering or leaving the tunnel would remain undetected. When the quest didn't update as expected, Francis announced, "Should we go back in and tell them it's done?" "Yeah, probably," Jake said. "Anything to get that quest update, right?" The pair plunged themselves back into the darkness and began working their way back through the dark tunnel in search of the bartender and the orc. Shortly after they'd entered into the tunnel, though, they saw Freya walking gingerly in their direction, and behind her they saw a horrifying sight. Dozens of orcs, goblins, hobs, gnomes, kobolds, elves, dwarves, and everything else. Francis could remember from fantasy lore followed Freya. They were not smiling, happy faces, however. These people looked as though they had lived their entire lives underground, malnourished and barely able to walk under their own power. The group stopped before Francis and Jake. "Quest update. There's something not quite right about how the people of the city feel about outsiders or the other races. Lead the way to safety. This is a multi-part quest. Rewards varies. Experience. Gold. Reputation boosts with unknown." Jake didn't need the quest notification to work this one out, and apparently neither did Francis. Both men turned and walked slowly back to where they had breached the surface, and to freedom for these beings. When they reached the daylight filtering through the tunnel entrance, some of the creatures started to walk a little quicker than they had before, and it seemed to Francis as though this could have been the first time they'd actually seen daylight in quite a while. Within moments they had scrambled past the two humans and disappeared into the woodland without so much as a second look back, and although he hadn't been in freedom for very long, the sight made Francis smile. Then a shout made his smile disappear, and his blood turned cold. "They're coming! Run for your lives!" The voice was unmistakable, and Talon almost immediately appeared in the tunnel, followed by a few unhappy-looking humans. What was worse, though, was that following behind them came the sound of some heavily armored soldiers. "Come on!" Francis shouted to Jake as he leapt back into the tunnel, ready to defend the escapees. Jake didn't need to be told twice and began to run astride his friend. "We don't have any weapons," Jake panted. "It's the first quest," Francis replied, and that was enough of an explanation. The first quests were always more like tutorials, so they knew they weren't really in any danger here. This was not a regular MMORPG, though. This was Freedom Online, and if ever there was a place where things simply weren't fair, this was it. Jake and Francis passed the group led by Talon and arrived face-to-face with 5 heavily armored soldiers holding swords. Unable to stop themselves, the pair barreled into the men, making them all tumble to the ground with shouts of outrage and pain. "My arm! My arm!" Francis heard Jake screaming as he tried his best to get to his feet. He looked to where the screaming was coming from and could see that Jake's arm had been severed at the elbow, and was bleeding freely out onto the dirt. "You thought you could get away with all this?" One of the soldiers who had managed to raise himself to his feet proclaimed. "It's to the ranks with you. A bit of military service will straighten you out, no doubt." And with that, the man punched Francis on the nose, and the last thing he heard before his vision faded to black was a loud cracking sound. "Quest complete. You have freed the slaves hiding beneath the black horse. Speak to a member of the resistance to collect your reward." Unconscious. You have been rendered unconscious. Duration, 5 minutes.